The story begins with the fact that a group of cars rode along the streets of the city. The situation with superpowers and super knights began for a long time. Dark nooks of micro-districts have become even more dangerous. The waiter grabbed the guy by the clothes and put him out of the bar. He shouted to drink outside and not shit in the store. Bai, in a drunk voice, answered the man that he had not even started. The main character put a bottle and noticed that the alcohol was over. Bai was very surprised. He knocked on the bottle and looked inside. At this time, he heard a scream of help on the side. The protagonist looked carefully aside. He was still holding a bottle in his hands. The protagonist noticed how in a lane groups of hooligans molested a girl. The stranger angrily shouted a frightened girl named G that she was walking alone in the gateway. Nearby stood another evil hooligan with a cigarette. G said in a trembling voice that she usually walks another road. She wanted to cut and stumbled upon a gang of local bandits. One of the bandits grabbed a stranger by the clothes and pulled her aside. He shouted to another bully to knock the girl on the head. G lay on the ground and called help. Hooligans attacked her from above. One of the fighters turned and told the other bandits that they had guests. Nearby stood the main character with a bottle. Bai closed the neck of the bottle with a cork and asked displeasedly from the bully, "What are they doing here?" The bandit viciously told the chief hero to fail as soon as possible. Other hooligans held the girl and also looked displeased at Bai. One of the hooligans swung and prepared to finish the protagonist with his hand. Bai calmly put his hand forward and blocked the blow from the bandit. The main character sharply jumped up and swung his feet to knock down his opponent. Bai threw the bully with a powerful blow to the side and he flew. The bandit at full speed flew to the side and hit his head in another bully. The main character launched a bottle in the head against one of the attackers. He did not have time to deviate. Bai extended his leg forward in time and was able to catch a falling bottle in time. Bai caught a bottle in time in his hand. He told himself that he almost spilled the drink. An angry bandit viciously shouted to his subordinates that it was better for them to dump it as soon as possible. The hooligans began to run away. One of the fighters angrily shouted after the main character that they would still find him. Bai closed the bottle and asked the girl if she was all right. G sat on the ground and thanked the guy. She said that she was fine. G viciously looked at the appearance of the protagonist and was very scared. Bai recognized the girl. He pointed her finger at her and asked what she forgot here. G shouted displeasedly to the main character that he constantly followed her. The main character asked the girl with displeasure. How could she know him? They had never seen each other before. G shouted angrily to the guy that she saw him a couple of times when he was looking behind her. She threatened to call the police. Bai thought displeasedly to himself that he was very unlucky in life. The main character in a dissatisfied voice told the interlocutor that she pulled him out, and that means he did not need to blame him. G scaredly asked the guy what he wants to do. She demanded that he do not approach her. Bai sharply headed to the side past the girl. She was very scared. G calmed down and looked in front of her. The main character turned around and looked at her. The leader ran away with his subordinates. He shouted in fright that the guy is definitely a Superman. The bandit frightenedly reminded the boss that they themselves also had superpower. He did not understand why they escaped. The boss explained in a frightened voice that if the protagonist is a superpower hunter, then they will end. The hooligan asked the leader if the guy really looked like a hunter. The boss strictly told the subordinate that super enemy usually hides their forces, so as not to become the target of superpowers hunters. The guy can really fight on equal terms with real hunters. It was better for them to escape as soon as possible. Bai stood on the roof of the house around. It was evening. He shouted to the bandits that they were very careful. The protagonist shouted on top of the house frightened bandits that they should be very careful. The bully on the ground looked fearfully at the protagonist. Nearby stood an excited boss. Bai opened a bottle and drank a drink. He viciously shouted to the bandits that the whole city already knew about them. The main character was a 4th-level hunter. He was preparing to capture the target. The main character sharply jumped to the ground from the roof of the house. He demanded that the bandits surrender in a good way, and he would not punish them. The bandits scaredly shouted that in front of them is a hunter for superlines. The boss told the bully that the rival was alone and could not do anything to them. He said that he is now transforming and grabbing Bai. The main character raised his hand and a bright glow appeared in front of him. He told the hooligans that wretched clothes on them. Bai said that criminals spend all the stolen money on dark crystals. He promised the bandits that he would cleanse the city of such garbage as them. An angry boss raised his hand in front of him. He viciously told the guy that he sounds like an idiot. The body of the bandit began to transform into a huge monster. He shouted to the guy that he could speak directly if he wants to take their strength. The body of the boss became huge and blue. He shouted to the main character that he could not even break him through a rocket. The boss swung his hand and prepared to hit the guy. He shouted that they would see in hell. The main character abruptly ran to the side. The monster missed and hit the space with his hand. The mutant was very angry and shouted loudly. The bandits next to him were very scared. The main character abruptly selected a side and shouted to the opponent that he was a big joker. At the back of him was a bright glow. Bai told the mutant in a displeased voice that he compared his scorching radiance with some kind of rocket. Bai angrily looked at the bandits and sternly told them that their turn had come. The hooligans were frightened. They were numb and frightenedly looked at Bai. The bandits turned around and ran aside. They wanted to escape from the protagonist. The bandits scaredly fled to the side. The main character raced next to him. Bai, with all his might, with a powerful blow, crushed a bully. Everything around was in blue fog. The guy collected small fragments on the ground. Bai counted displeasedly and realized that he had collected only 17 fragments. He needed 3 more fragments this month. The girl woke up and came to her senses. She opened her eyes and saw the ceiling. Ji was lying on the bed. She put her hand in her head and felt that she was dizzy. The girl looked scaredly at her hand and noticed a bracelet on her. She did not understand what it was. Ji looked as a scared to the side and noticed how the guy drank a drink from a bottle. She could not understand where he brought her. The girl was very scared and became worried. She looked at her feet. Ji was silent, scared, and piercingly looked down in front of her. After a small pause, the girl said in a relaxed voice that everything seems to be all. The main character from behind moved to his new acquaintance and asked if she woke up. Ji was scared and screamed loudly. The girl bounced to the side. She scaredly shouted to the guy that she could give him money if he leaves her alive. She promised not to report to the police. The main character angrily extended his hand to the girl and shouted so that she would not twitch. Ji scaredly closed her head with her hands and shouted to the guy that she was not moving. Bai carefully extended a small bracelet to the girl's head. She was still scared. Bai gently laid a bracelet on the neck of a frightened girl and he slammed shut. Ji was very scared. She did not understand what the main character did to her. The girl frightened the guy and asked what he wanted. Bai in the headphones displeasedly explained to the interlocutor that she should not escape. Ji scaredly felt a collar on her neck. She held out her hand to him. The girl touched the collar with her hand. The main character shouted to her so that she would not touch him. The girl screamed very loudly. She felt a very strong electric shock. Bai consumed a drink from a bottle. He told the girl that if she tries to escape, he would die from the category of current. Ji lay on the floor unconscious. Ji asked the guy with a dissatisfied voice, why did he abduct her? The captive shouted insults against the protagonist. Bai strictly demanded that she shut up. The girl continued to scream loudly to the guy. He began to get angry. The main character looked angrily at the girl and shouted that he demanded her shut up. Ji got her hands in dismay. Bai angrily rushed behind the captive and shouted to sit silently. Ji screamed displeasedly. The guy strictly answered her that no one would hear her. Ji sat and cried in fright. She called Dad and Mom with a trembling voice. The main character looked at his captive for a long time. He studied her carefully. Bai sternly told the girl that an ordinary person would never have noticed surveillance among a huge crowd. He added that the girl was already attacked by the hunters for the supercan. Ji was very surprised and scared. She realized that the main character took her for a Superman. The girl returned and shouted to the guy that if she had power, then she would take him to bars. Bai answered the captive with displeasure that she could hide her abilities. He promised the girl that he would let her go after she sat for 15 days. Ji looked hopefully at the protagonist and asked if he would let her go. Bai calmly answered the girl that he would not need her later. Ji asked the protagonist if he could let her go earlier than 15 days later. Bai angrily ordered the captive to go to bed. The captive viciously told the main character that he just found for himself the reason to hold the beauty in the basement. Bai at this time drank a drink from a bottle. Bai displeasedly explained to the interlocutor to go to bed. Ji shouted displeasedly to the guy that she wanted to go to the toilet. The main character looked at the girl for a long time and silently. He did not know whether to allow her to go out. Bai held out his hand with a remote control to the girl and pressed the button. He said that she still could not escape. The captive looked at her arms in surprise and saw that her bracelet had fallen. Ji sat dissatisfied herself in the toilet room in complete silence. The girl in the toilet looked around and noticed that there was a mirror nearby. She decided to get out of this place as soon as possible. Ji thought displeasedly to herself that the main character could be a normal person. The girl thought and decided that the main character is handsome. She was confused only by his strange things. Suddenly, a thought came to the girl. She looked piercingly in front of her. Ji shook her head to the side and reminded herself that the main character abducted her. The girl cunningly decided to herself that when the guy leaves, she would take her phone and call the police. The evening went down to the big city. Everywhere in the houses the light shone brightly. The girl went to bed and carefully watched the main character. Bai went into the next room. The captive silently lay on the bed and carefully watched the guy's actions. Baishun took a large blue bag and put it in the toilet on the toilet. The hand of the main character lit up with a bright light. He prepared to put her in the box. Bai, without wasting time, swung very sharply with his hand and put it in the box. The box cover shut sharply and cut the guy's hand. He did not have time to remove her. Bai abruptly pulled the remaining hand back. Behind him, the girl watched through the door. Ji carefully watched the door behind the actions of the protagonist. She was very scared. Bai sharply turned his head to the side and looked at the runaway girl. The main character looked in displeasure and noticed that the door to the toilet was open. Bai said nothing. He looked displeased after the runaway captive and went in her direction. Ji's frightened lay on the floor. She asked the protagonist what happened to his hand. Bai stood and looked very angry at the girl. She saw that the guy had no half of his hand. The girl looked scared and piercingly at the guy. Due to excitement, she began to faint. The captive from experienced horror fell on the floor of the toilet in a fainting unconscious. Bai was very unhappy. He stood in front of the unconscious body of the girl and looked at her. The night came and morning came. The city was very brightly lit by the sun. The girl came to her senses. She looked up and said that she again fainted. Suddenly, Ji was very surprised at something. She put her hand to her head. The captive looked in the window with amazement and noticed that it was already morning on the street. The girl looked aside and noticed food on the table. She realized that this was breakfast. Ji noticed a note on the table. The main character wrote that she was sitting quietly, and he would come soon. The girl was surprised to take the note in her hands. She realized that the main character had gone somewhere. Ji was very happy. She smiled at herself and said that she had a great chance. The main character stood on the roof of the house and held the phone in his hands. He was waiting for a meeting. The partner wrote to the main character on the phone that he had already come to his place. Bai looked with interest to the side and noticed how the door to the roof opened. Someone came. A stranger with blonde hair took off his glasses. He went with a suitcase to the main character and greeted him. Bai asked his partner, did he really like to be late? The guest smiled and said that there were problems on the way. The main character threw a whole bunch of crystals to the guest and said that he had gathered it in a month. The partner extended his hand forward and immediately caught a flying crystal with it. The guy carefully studied the blue crystal in his hand. He said that the dark crystals of the Omega are a rarity. The guy hid the crystals in his pocket and handed a suitcase to the main character. He praised him for work. The buyer said cunningly to the main character that he only takes in cash. Bai carefully studied the money in the suitcase. Without wasting time, the main character, along with a suitcase, jumped down from the roof of the building. The client hid the stone in his jacket pocket. After that, he grabbed his phone and dialed the number. The buyer called the interlocutor on the phone and called her Mrs. Hu. Madame Hu sat inside a huge and luxurious building surrounded by servants. The hostess was sitting on a large couch. She had a servant from below. She promised the employee that the money would be transferred to his account. The subordinate said that he put the main character in the case of the main character. The servant sat near the lady's feet and gently painted her fingers. The hostess promised the subordinate that she would increase his reward if he personally takes up the main character. The fighter slyly answered the woman that he is only for those things that he can do. The subordinate answered the mistress that she did not need to underestimate the protagonist. The woman answered the guy displeased that this was not his mind. Suddenly the servant's hand slipped to the side, and he scratched the mistress with a brush. Hu was very angry. She looked very strictly and viciously at the servant. The woman hit the servant with displeasure with her foot, and shouted that he was not capable of even simple things. The woman ordered the subordinate to be trained the protagonist by the beacon. She demanded that Bai were not killed without her presence. The servant answered the lady that he would do everything. Hu looked strictly aside. She decided that she had finally found the protagonist. The woman put her hands wide to the side and opened the door. After that, she went outside. The hostess went into the next room. In front of her was a bright blue dome. Hu saw a man's body in front of him in the dome. She told him that he would soon return to this world. The woman held out her hand to the dome and told the man that she would take away from the guy what belongs only to him. After that, the whole world will bend in front of them. Hu thoughtfully thought about herself, that she personally will tear the bastard into 1,000 pieces. The girl in the apartment of the protagonist swung a chair and hit the window by force. Ji was very angry. She knocked in the glass with a chair and could not knock him out. The captive fell in displeasure to the floor. The door was closed, and she did not have a phone. After that, she wanted to eat. Ji turned to the side and noticed how food with a glass of water was standing next to her on the table. The girl felt very hungry. She grabbed a piece of food with a fork and began to eat it. Ji consumed food with appetite. She said joyfully to herself that she needed to eat. The main character walked along the street. At this time, some ninja watched him from the tree. The observer looked at the guy and thought that he needed to get inside the house and arrange an ambush for him. Bai went to the house. He did not notice, as if he had something to sway his house. The main character stopped abruptly. He stood and looked very carefully at the roof of the building. Bai turned to the side displeasedly. He looked suspiciously at his house. The well-fed Ji sat on the couch. She spread her hands to the side and said in a joyful voice that she had eaten. The girl heard from the side how the door opened. She looked carefully and decided that the guy had returned. Ji watched carefully as the door to the room opened. She was very scared. The girl scaredly noticed how some stranger put her hand through the door. The protagonist sharply jumped with a suitcase to his balcony. He realized that something had happened. Bai went very carefully and looked through his window inside the house. The main character was very surprised and frightened. He looked intently through the window. Bai was surprised to notice how his guest climbed into the TV, and only his legs stuck out of the screen. The main character watched with excitement. As the girl gradually disappeared on the TV, the guy was surprised to notice how only the girl's feet stuck out of the TV screen. Bai squeezed his hand with a glove into a fist with all his might. He realized that the girl was a Superman. The main character abruptly jumped into the room. There was a bright blue glow around him. Bai hurriedly held out his hand to the black box, which stood on a table near the TV. The main character abruptly pulled an electronic box with the TV. Bai looked in front of him. He realized that his captive had disappeared somewhere. The guy looked in front of him into the wall. He did not understand where the girl had gone. The main character looked at the lying screen on the floor. He realized that the girl could not move through the cable, and the TV was disconnected. Bai looked very carefully in front of him and thought deeply. The main character sharply rushed to the side and held out his hand forward. Bai decided to break through the wall. With all his might, he hit his hand in a scale with his hand. The protagonist knocked out the wall in the house with all his might and jumped out into the street. Bai, surrounded by a bright blue radiance, turned around and carefully looked at the wall of the house. The main character looked at the wall of the building. He remembered that the girl was supposed to be killed from the collar if she left the apartment. Bai was very amazed. He realized that the girl of the Superman could escape before. The main character stood thoughtfully in the room. Behind him on the ground was a small piece of wood. Suddenly, a wooden piece increased sharply in size. The main character did not notice him. Suddenly, a piece of wood abruptly flew forward and pierced from the back of a surprised guy. The main character was very surprised and frightened after the injury behind. He did not understand what happened. Suddenly, a huge piece of wood got out of the floor and pierced the protagonist into the back of the protagonist. Bai hung pierced in the back and could not free himself in any way. He felt severe pain. The main character felt very severe pain in the back. He barely restrained himself so as not to scream. Blood marks appeared on the guy's back. A piece of wood with all his might hit him on the wall. The main character hit the wall and cracks appeared around. Above him was a large wooden thorn. The beaten guy was very wounded. He had a bloody cough. The main character tried to get to his feet. He held his hand behind the wall and in his back he had a big wound. Bai felt severe pain in the body. He put his hand to the body to heal himself. The protagonist healed the wound with his hand. He had smoke from his back. The guy stood on his feet confidently. The wooden claw was viciously behind him, told him that he could really be reborn in flame. Bai realized that he was hearing a male voice behind himself. He did not understand where the stranger could know about his regeneration. A wooden piece turned into a large fist. He shouted to the main character that his former flame would not harm him in any way. Bai very sharply and quickly deviated back to protect himself from the blow of a wooden fist. The main character swung sharply and hit a wooden fist. He broke him into two parts. The wooden stump told the man that because of his ability, he could not harm him in any way. Bai, scared to himself, realized that the stranger controlled the surrounding objects. He asked an invisible opponent, "Where is the girl?" The main character saw in surprise, as a large wooden round box appeared in front of him. The stranger asked if the guy needs his lover. Bai was very amazed. He noticed how the outlines of his girlfriend appeared in front of him. The wooden monster stood in full height. He said for the protagonist that now his girlfriend is his girlfriend. Ji was connected and her mouth was tied. A wooden mutant laid a hand on the girl's head and sternly said that he wanted to get her strength. After that, not a single enemy will be terrible. The main character extended his hand forward and stopped the monster. The wooden demon looked at the man with displeasure. Bai told the demon that he could never kill him. He demanded that the monster stand nearby and apologize. The wooden mutant silently looked at the protagonist. A frightened girl opened one eye. The monster grabbed the girl by the head with his wooden hand. He viciously shouted to the main character that this place no longer belonged to him. The main character scaredly saw how a huge stone ball fell in front of him and fell apart into two parts. Bai stood aside and frightenedly noticed how the stone ball formed a single hole. He ended up inside him. Bai looked out from the inside of a stone ball. The halves squeezed him from both sides and he could not get out. The demon swung a huge hand. He shouted to the guy to answer for his words. After a blow from the monster, the stone ball scattered into pieces. The main character bounced to the side. There was a powerful explosion and a large hole appeared in the wall. Bai was attributed to the side of a stream of water. A heavily beaten Bai sharply extended his bloodied hand to the side. On the hand of the protagonist there was a magic sign. A large box flew into the room through the hole in the wall. A large box flew up to the hand of a guy sitting on the couch and grabbed him. The main character inside the box felt for bright rings inside it. The main character sharply pulled out his hand out of the box. Around there were bright luminous zippers. A wooden monster grabbed the girl by the hair from behind and shouted that her boyfriend would suffer. Suddenly the mutant was frightened. He looked at the protagonist with great excitement. Bai was sitting on the couch. There was a box next to him, and there were bright flashes around him. The monster was amazed. He could not understand where the electricity could be near. Ji was very surprised. She looked at the guy in amazement. Around the protagonist there were bright flashes. He said with surprise that he could not get used to these pieces. Every second, his body seemed to be noisy. The protagonist angrily extended his hand to the opponent. He viciously said that he would now feel his new abilities. A bright flash of electricity appeared. Bai could use such a skill on a 5-meter defeat radius. With careful use, he could control and intercept radio signals. The wooden demon looked in front of him at the protagonist. Bright lightning sparkled around. Bai turned out to be suddenly behind his opponent and viciously asked him where he stared. The demon was scared. He realized that someone had just appeared behind him. The wooden monster swung and hit the wall with all his might. The main character, along with the girl, bounced aside. Ji was very scared. From her excitement, she even flew glasses from her face. The main character was surrounded by bright lightning. A frightened girl lay on the ground behind him. Bai stood and looked aside. He held out her glasses in his hand. Ji was very amazed. She took her glasses in her hands and looked at the guy in surprise. The demon was very amazed. He shouted to the man that he was underestimating him. There was a very bright flash, and a strong explosion appeared. The main character attacked the monster. Bai stood near a huge hole in the wall. The demon told the guy that he could smash the whole house, but there would be no sense. The demon appeared from the ceiling. He told the man that while his main body is intact, the victory will be on his side. He demanded that the guy give up. The main character sharply rushed forward and hit the floor with all his might. Stones scattered around. The monster was very amazed. He could not understand why the main character beat the earth and what he wanted to get from this. The guy grabbed the electric cable. The monster could not understand why the wires of the mains are underground. Bai looked angrily at the opponent and said that there was a network of electric cables in the walls of the apartment and underground. The monster looked at the man very viciously and said that he did not believe him. The main character abruptly ran out of the hole in the house. He carried a girl in his arms. Bai pulled the wire in his hands with all his might. He held a frightened girlfriend in his arms. The protagonist held the cable from the house in the hands of the cable. Electric energy was walking along them. There was a very bright explosion in the house. Electric flashes appeared everywhere. The demon screamed after the explosion in the house. He was carried out through a hole in the wall. After an explosion in the building, a wooden mutant fell to the ground and rolled aside. The monster rose above the ground. He could not understand where the person got the power and where the electricity came from. The mutant held out his hand in front of him and decided that he needed to hide as soon as possible underground. The protagonist suddenly appeared on the side of the surprised opponent and reminded him that he would have enough 1 minute. The demon looked scared at the man and invited him to agree. The main character swung and hit his opponent from above with all his might. Bai, with all his strength, nailed a wooden monster to the ground and flattened it. The main character finished off the powerful blow of his opponent. The wooden mutant shouted loudly. The girl in dismay asked the guy, "Did he really kill the monster?" "Bye, I'll look at my hand." He said that he gave the mutant a chance, but he did not use it. The protagonist held out his hand forward and said that superlated the opponent now belongs to him. Bai stood and held a hand inside the box. A bluish glow came from it. The main character extended a piece of a severed hand from a metal box on the side. The girl scaredly noticed that the guy had his hair ordinary. Bai at that time put his left hand to the place where the right hand was chopped off. Very quickly, the guy regenerated his hand. He looked at her carefully. The main character fell on one knee. He looked exhausted in the ground in front of him. The guy had a mark on his hand. Bai thought that in order to unite with another object, I needed a few seconds. The main character was on his knees. He carefully followed the mark on his hand. There was a very strong explosion. A bunch of stones appeared from the ground in front of the main character. A bunch of stones took off on the road. A frightened girl stood nearby. Ji looked scared at the protagonist. Bai looked at her angrily and said that he liked this ability. The girl smiled slyly and asked him to take off her collar and let her go. The main character stood his back. He told the girl that the security system was destroyed and the collar no longer works. Ji held a bracelet in her hands. Bai, without turning around, told the girl a displeased voice that the mutant attacked her, and she did nothing to break out. The girlfriend looked in surprise at the protagonist. She did not know what to answer him. The girl smiled joyfully for the protagonist and said that she now wants to go. Ji turned and went aside. She slyly thought that the guy should not see that she had the strength again. The main character cunningly turned to the side and looked after the walking girl. The main character saw a small girl. She walked with a toy in her hands and called her brother. Bai turned around and shouted after a frightened girl to stop. King asked the protagonist displeasedly, why did he need her? The main character went aside. He shouted to the girl to follow him. Bai went to a large garage gate and lifted them above his head. The main character, along with a girlfriend, went into the garage. There was a racing red car. Bai told the girl to get into the car with him. Ji was very surprised and admired. She shouted to the guy that she agreed. Shine is the ability to merge with solid objects and complete control within a radius of 10 meters. Separate objects that go abroad under the control zone cannot change more. 2 seconds are needed to merge. The girl turned around displeasedly and asked the protagonist with surprise, where did he get such a beautiful car? Bai crumpled in his hands a piece of soft plastic. He reminded the girl that when she left the house, she had shoes. The main character began to squeeze a piece of plastic in his hand and give him some form. Very quickly in the hands of the protagonist, a small pair of shoes for a girl appeared. Ji was surprised to turn to the guy. Bai held blue shoes in his hand and said that the girl put them on. Blue shoes were very bright. She shone and the girl looked at her with admiration. Ji joyfully held shoes in her hand and told herself that they were very beautiful. The girl was very admired. She pressed the shoes to her and prepared to dress her. Ji put on her shoes and joyfully shouted that they were just her size. The girl looked joyfully at the protagonist and said that all this is very cool. Suddenly, the girlfriend shyly looked down in front of her. The guy asked her, what is it? A girlfriend called her name for the protagonist and asked what his name is. The protagonist was excitedly prepared to name his name for the interlocutor. Ji got aside scared. She did not notice how some monster appeared behind her. The main character was scared. He saw how an unfamiliar mutant rushed behind the girl. Ji looked aside. The monster behind her held a huge steel blade in his hand. The protagonist managed to do it in time. He put his hand forward to protect the girl, and the mutant pierced her with a knife. The main character shoved the girl aside and she fell into the car interior. Ji swung his hand and hit the mutant on the head with all his might. The main character was very amazed. He realized that his opponent was made of steel and very strong. The mutant looked angrily and with hatred at the guy. He prepared to attack him. Suddenly, the monster swung with his hand and hit the man on the head with all his might. The main character received a very strong blow to the face. He had blood from his mouth. The girl was very scared. She realized that her friend was very wounded. The main character found the strength to rise in himself. He squeezed his hand into his fist and prepared to attack. Bai screamed loudly. He immediately prepared to attack the mutant with his hand. The protagonist hit the monster with a fist with all his might. After that, there was a bright blue flash. Bai heard some suspicious noise around him. He realized that there were still mutants around. The protagonist looked aside and noticed how the mutants with weapons stood next to him. One of the monsters approached the guy and shot him in the head with some kind of solution. The protagonist was scaredly understood that the suppressor had just been used against him. The mutant grabbed a man in his hands and raised him high above the ground. After another blow from the opponent, the main character coughed and he had blood. The mutant grabbed his knife and turned him out in the hand of the protagonist. After that, He crushed the guy with his foot to the ground. The mutant from behind turned his hand in the main character. Bai managed to rest his hand on the floor so as not to fall. From the side appeared Mrs. Ho. The girl looked at her with a frightened look at her. The woman went to the main character and said cunningly that she did not think that such a day would come. Bai stood on one knee on the ground. The mutant behind him held his hand with a knife. Hu viciously glanced at the guy and said that she had been waiting for this for a very long time. Surprised Ji could not understand what kind of woman was in front of her and who her minions were. The lady looked at the protagonist and said that he could not even light a cigarette with the help of his flame. A metal ampule stuck out in his head. Hu told the guy that he could not use his superpowers for half an hour. The demoness angrily told the guy that until she was going to kill him, she promised to ask the heat for Bai until she herself was pleased. The main character looked at the woman displeased and asked who she was. The mistress looked angrily and in surprise at the man. She did not expect that he did not know her. Ji was surprised due to the fact that the main character was not familiar with the woman. Hu laughed very viciously to herself. A frightened girl was sitting in front of her. Madame viciously told the main character that he will have a terrible fate. Hu turned around and angrily asked the guy, where did he get the ability to regenerate? Bai was very scared and surprised when he heard such words from a woman. The protagonist remembered some old battle. A warrior with white hair burned in the fire. Hu strictly asked the guy, would this bring his memories? The main character told the woman that she had once been next to the guy before. He could not remember the name. Madame viciously told the guy that he finally remembered. She promised to kill him and erase all his loved ones into the powder. Jai sat in a car and greeted a woman with a smile. The girl with a smile advised the woman to take the money from the guy, so it will be better than just killing each other. Hu was surprised when I heard such words from a girl. She looked at her with displeasure. Hu looked at the girl in a car and laughed very viciously. Hu shouted that all this was nonsense. She rushed to the car to grab Ji. The main character realized that he needed to save the girl. He shoved his hand from the ground. Suddenly, the car and the girl rose sharply. Hu bounced to the side. The mistress looked in surprise to the side. She did not believe that it was the power of the sandbox. Ji inside the car rose above the ground. She moved away from the house. The car, along with the girl, sharply moved aside. She went to the cliff. The racing car, along with a frightened girl, fell down from the cliff. Ji stood near a large cliff. There were frightened fighters next to her. Hu turned around in surprise and looked at the guy. She did not understand how he could use the forces of the sandbox. The mistress looked in surprise at the guy. He was still standing on one knee near her. The woman realized that the main character used his hand. He united it with the dark cross of the sandbox. Hu decided that in the box there were hands with other abilities. The woman turned into a guy displeasedly and shouted that she would destroy him now. Suddenly, a huge claw made his way through the wall. Nearby stood gas cylinders. A huge claw pierced a gas cylinder and a strong hiss was heard. The gas exploded and the mistress hit a very strong shockwave on the side. Bai squeezed his hand into his fist and prepared to attack one of the robots. The mutant angrily looked at the protagonist and held out his hand to him with a knife. Around the woman was a very bright white explosion. The main character ran nearby. Hu turned sharply and felt as if lightning knocked on her tail. The mistress turned and looked at her bloodied tail with a very displeasure. The woman touched her tongue to her tail. She said viciously to the guy that he could not hide from the corporation of the world. The main character at full speed rushed through the forest. There was a bright glow around him. The guy ran at full speed to catch up with the car inside, which was a girl. Bai jumped high after the dispersal to have time to jump inside the racing machine. Bai jumped into the passenger chair of the car. A frightened girl was sitting behind the wheel. The main character extended his hand to the car control panel and began to press the buttons. Ji looked at the guy in dismay and in surprise. She realized that the engine had launched. The main character strictly warned the girl to look at the road. Ji looked forward in front of her and realized that the racing car fell under the wheel of a truck. The body of Hu Fenya covers black gold. The fortress of this metal is much larger than that of diamonds. The body of the lady immediately heals after the injury. The main character angrily asked the girl, does she really want to run away? They rushed with her in a red car along the road. Bai jumped to his feet on the car and shouted to the girl to rush forward. Ji scaredly asked the guy what he wanted to do. Bai wrapped his head to the side and carefully looked into the forest. He noticed some kind of movement there. The protagonist saw how mutants fled in the forest. He realized that he could not hide with the girl by car. The fighters rushed through the forest and jumped from wood to wood. Next to them, the mistress flew through the air. The lady turned around in the flight and looked at the protagonist. She followed him. Bai looked at his hand with great attention. He realized that his electricity was over. In the box, the guy had several hands for a merger. He needed 2 seconds. The guy decided to distract the pursuers and move at the speed of electricity. This was to help escape. The main character pressed the button. The box opened and a hand flew out of it. Bai caught a flying hand and decided that he would distract the pursuers with the help of an explosion of scorching radiance. The main character swung his hand. He decided to calculate the power of the explosion at such a distance. Bai swung with all his might and launched his hand far to the side. She flew over the forest. The main character extended his hand forward, and an electric radiance went from her. The protagonist, standing on a car, extended his hand forward and directed the lightning to a flying hand. A very bright explosion rang out over his head. Everything around was brightly lit. Ji glanced in fear. The lady in flight extended her hand forward. There was a very bright explosion in front of her. Hugh looked as a scared to the side and decided that the guy wanted to distract them. The main character in the car grabbed a frightened girl in his arms and shouted that they were leaving. The racing car with a large acceleration shot down the fence and flew into the abyss. The mistress pulled away from the trees and jumped down. She shouted to the guy that he could not escape from her in this way. The woman landed on the road after the jump. She went to a broken fence. The mistress stood near the edge of the road and carefully looked down at the cliff. Hu looked carefully and noticed a smoking red car there. The mistress did not notice how a huge truck drove up to her and lit up. The truck stopped abruptly. The driver and passenger looked angrily at the woman. Hu viciously turned to the side and looked at the car. She swung her tail and cut the car in half. 2 men were scared in a broken car. Madame viciously said that the main character was able to escape, but he would die soon. The main character, along with his companion, landed under the bridge. Bai leaned on his hand on the ground. A very frightened girlfriend stood behind him. The main character looked at his hand with interest. He thought that the electricity ended, and his body was already on the verge. Bai felt his forces leave and leaned his hands from the wall. The girl on the side told the guy that he was injured and they need to go to the hospital. The main character stood near the wall. He thought that he needed to wait for the end of the inhibitor. Bai could no longer stand on his feet and fell near the wall to the ground. The main character felt a very strong breakdown in the body. He put his hand in his pocket. Bai took out a small piece of paper from his pocket. His hands were trembling very much. The main character held a piece of paper in his hands and carefully looked at her. It was a photograph. Bai was holding a photograph of the girl Xiaonian in his hands. He promised her to save her. Ji asked the protagonist from the side, was Xiao his girlfriend really? The protagonist told the girl displeased that she would leave here. Soon they had to go after him. Ji looked at her friend with great attention. She did not tell him anything. Ji turned away in displeasure. She decided to take the protagonist with her. The girl grabbed the guy's hand and shouted so that he would rise soon. Ji held her friend's hand. She shouted angrily so that the guy saved his girlfriend. The girl angrily shouted to the guy that he himself was the only hope of his girlfriend. Bai looked angrily in front of him and said that he would surely save the girl. The main character thought. He looked in front of him and did not say anything to the girl. Ji grabbed her friend's hand and led him forward. Bai barely stood on his feet. The main character was barely standing on his feet. He called his girlfriend next to him. Bai looked aside and told the girl thoughtfully that today they would not die. Ji looked at the protagonist displeasedly. She did not answer him. After a small pause, the girl smiled at the guy and said that they could now go. Suddenly, the ceiling crashed from above and prepared to land. The main character, along with the girl, stood from below and did not suspect anything. Ji glanced up in fear. The main character was scared and looked up in front of him. Ji decided to save her friend. She held out her hands to him and pulled him aside. The girl with all her might pulled the protagonist to the side and the guy flew back. The main character fell back. He frightened his hands to his girlfriend. Ji looked at her friend with fright. She did not understand what she was doing. The main character with fright saw in front of him how the lady landed in front of him. Bai slowly turned to the side and silently looked at his girlfriend. The girl joyfully looked at her friend and called him her name. The exhausted protagonist barely stood on his feet. Madame viciously told him that the girl gave her life to save him. But now his turn has come. Bai saw how combat mutants attacked him from the side of him from all sides. The main character tried to fight off the monsters who attacked him. One of the fighters swung on the side and stuck a knife into his chest. The main character was very wounded. He had blood from his mouth. Bai looked up and noticed how near him a hand was lying near a pile of stones. The main character looked at the lying hand. He remembered the promise for the girl that today they would not die. The main character felt a surge of strength in the body. A bright radiance appeared near him. Near the body of the protagonist, there was a bright blue radiance. One of the mutants flew away from him. The mistress saw a bright radiance in front of her. She covered herself with her hand. The body of the protagonist became more and more bright. There was a blue radiance around. Hu shouted in fright that this is impossible. The guy had to be still on the actions of the inhibitor. The main character jumped to his feet. Bright lightning continued around him. One of the mutants took out his weapons and began to shoot a man from him. In the direction of the protagonist, metal ampules flew from the side. Bai turned to his gaze to the side and the ampules scattered into pieces. Ji looked in displeasure to the side. She said with surprise that the high temperature neutralized the inhibitor. The main character held out his hand to the side. The fighters fled to him from the side. The guy's hand began to glow. He pointed to her aside the running mutants. The main character attacked his rivals with the help of a bright blue flash. One burning mutant was lying on the ground after an attack from the protagonist. The lady looked aside and noticed how the main character rushed past her from the side. The woman was very scared when she saw that the guy appeared straight in front of her. Hu was scared due to the fact that the guy was able to strengthen his right hand to a large extent. Madame abruptly bounced back to protect herself from the guy. The woman looked angrily at the protagonist. Bai saw a cut hand lying under the stones. Bai held out his hands forward and raised a huge stone. He needed to get to the hand of the girl. The main character sharply threw the large stone to the side. He continued to disassemble the rubble. Bai lifted a huge stone and looked at what was lying from him. The protagonist looked closely and noticed how his girlfriend was lying under the rubble of stones. Her body was beaten. Bai held the girl on his hands. She was bloodied and unconscious. The main character looked at the battered and bloodied hand of a girlfriend. The guy looked at the ground and saw that the girl's beaten shoes stood there. The main character with his hand raised the girl's head and raised her above the ground. Suddenly, Bai sharply extended his hand to his chest and stuck his fingers deep there. The fingers of the protagonist entered the chest and he grabbed the heart inside. Hu was surprised. She watched the guy and did not understand what he was doing. The main character took a small black pebble with his hand in his chest. Bai put a small black pebble with his hand and put it in his throat for the girl. The main character held the girl's head with his hand. He called her by name. Bai looked at the unconscious girlfriend and called her his name. The main character with his own hands gently laid the girl's body on the ground. Bai stepped aside. He began to gently climb up piles of stones. The protagonist stood on a bunch of stones at full height. He looked viciously at the woman. The mistress stood at a short distance and carefully watched the guy. Hu viciously reminded the guy that she was going to kill all his loved ones. The main character raised his hand and pointed a finger at the woman. She was very surprised. Hu pointed a finger at a woman and angrily threatened that he would kill her. Angry Bai awakens his hidden form. In this state, all indicators increase. But the time of action of this form is very short. A very bright flash appeared above the building. Electric lightning flashed everywhere. The mistress saw a very bright flash in front of her. She sharply bounced back. The main character appeared from the side. He ran to the woman from the back to attack her. Hu of the frightened turned back and looked at the guy. The protagonist hit her with all her might and she flew back. Madame glanced angrily at the guy. She felt that he had raised his level to the 5th. Hu jumped forward very sharply and quickly damped in the air. Bai held out his luminous hand forward. He prepared to attack the opponent. Bai jumped up and began to attack the girl with his foot. The main character held out his hand and grabbed the demoness by the tail to further attack. Bai held the tail of the mistress in his hands and swung with all his might to hit her on the ground. The woman was very scared. The main character with all his might hit her body on the ground. Bai looked at his rival with an evil look. He prepared to attack her further. The main character looked aside and noticed how a woman flew in the direction of a neighboring building. The guy sharply jumped from the roof and flew forward to pursue the opponent. Bai swung sharply and with his hand in flight and prepared to attack the opponent. Hu abruptly flew to the side. The protagonist hit the building with all his might. The main character turned sharply and rushed in flight to pursue an opponent. The protagonist shot down a woman in flight with all his might and she fell down. An unconscious girl lay on the ground. A battle took place above her. Ji could not understand where she was, she decided, that she is dead. The girl soared in parallel blue reality. She felt as if something was burning in her chest. There were still a lot of wounds on the body of Ji. She held out her hand to the side. Ji continued to feel how she fell into some deep blue abyss. Bai turned to the side and watched his rival very carefully. The main character held out his hand back and prepared to swing to attack. Bai sharply waved his hand forward and prepared to hit the frightened demoness. The protagonist hit the woman with all his strength, and a large stream of energy flew on her. Hu closed her hand to defend herself from the attack of the protagonist. Energy began to hit her body. The main character raised his hand up and a bright lightning went down to him. The guy swung, and with his hand and bright lightning struck the woman from above. Suddenly, the body of the demoness began to transform. She had her eyes brightly lit up. The body of the demoness began to glow very brightly. It has become yellow-bent. The transformed Hu viciously told the guy that he had awakened hidden forces, but he could not do this alone. The main character, scared, looked at the rival. He realized that she had become much stronger. The demoness angrily told the guy that she would not have come to his soul if she had not been ready. The woman knocked on her head with his claw. She told the guy that in the current state she is a Superman of the 6th level. The demoness sharply jumped forward and prepared to attack the protagonist. Bai sharply bounced and dodged him to defend himself from an attack by a demoness. The main character was very scared. He noticed that the rival quickly attacked him. He rushed forward at the guy. She shouted that he was very slow and he no longer has speed. The main character barely managed to defend himself. The guy had a bright hand. He viciously asked the woman, "Does she really want to quickly?" The demonic Hu stood in the center, and around her there was a bright white twist. Super Lane was a hidden form of energy at Hu. It has all indicators and the damage increases. She looked aside and noticed how a large bunch of blue energy flew at her. Hu put her hand in front of her and was able to defend herself from bright blue energy. The protagonist rushed forward to the opponent. He swung his hand. The guy attacked the demoness. Everything around was brightly shown in blue. Hu looked around, a very evil and suspicious look. The woman sharply hit the guy with her sharp blade and shouted that he was caught. There were traces of blood around. The main character, after a very strong wound from a woman, flew back. The wounded guy was very surprised and scared. He did not understand how a woman could catch him at such a speed. He rushed forward at the guy and with all her might hit him with her hand. The demoness rushed forward at the guy and he began to fly back. Bai managed to rest on the ground on the go to stop. The woman with all her might, pierced the body of the protagonist with a powerful blow. The main character extended his hands and grabbed the opponent's hand in his body with all his might. Hu viciously glanced at the opponent and said that his blood might not be enough for regeneration. The demoness continued to put pressure on the guy's body with her hand. She viciously reminded him of his brain. Bai held out his hands in front of him and held his opponent's hand. There was a bright blue glow above them. The main character felt severe pain in the body. He could no longer resist anymore. Hu put her hand forward and broke the guy's body through and through. The demoness unexpectedly noticed that all the moisture in the air concentrated in one place. Suddenly, the body of the girl Ji appeared in space. There was a blue radiance around her. The demoness viciously told the guy that he fed his girlfriend a dark crystal. Now Ji is also a Superman. The protagonist held his opponent's hand with his hand. He viciously told her that if you eat the dark crystal of the Omega level, then you can get a superpower. The main character looked angrily at the rival and asked what would happen to the red-hot metal if it is lowered into the water. Hu thought scaredly. She looked with excitement in front of her. Bright lightning appeared near the body of the protagonist. He shouted about a hot flame. The demoness sharply extended her hand in front of her to defend herself from the attack. Bright blue lightning sparkled everywhere in space. The main character prepared to save a girlfriend. Bai sharply jumped up and flew up. He decided to escape as soon as possible. The main character rose up. He carried his unconscious girlfriend in his arms. Highly in the sky, a bright blue twist appeared. The main character flew up. A bright explosion rang out in the sky, and blue energy fell into the demoness. She shouted to the guy that she would tear him 1,000 pieces. A huge volume of blue energy fell on top of a woman. She scaredly put her hands in front of her. Hu was very scared. It was nailed to the ground by a huge volume of blue liquid. The main character neatly went down to the ground. He held the body of a girlfriend in his hands. The exhausted guy turned around and looked very carefully. The protagonist saw his opponent's body froze and stood motionless on the ground. In the evening in the city there was a very heavy rain. A lonely woman walked along the street under an umbrella. The woman went to the door of the building and began to enter the code there. At this time, someone came up behind her. The passerby turned back and carefully began to look at the stranger. The woman went to the wet girl and called her name Qian Yu. After that, the woman turned to the side and noticed that someone else stood next to her. The main character stood in the rain and held a girlfriend in his hands. He called a woman named Zhan Fang Qin. The passerby looked at the guy with surprise and amazement. He stood motionless and held a girlfriend in his arms. The main character looked piercingly at the woman. Ji in his hands was unconscious. The woman was surprised to call the protagonist by name. Next to her stood a frightened girl. The main character, along with his acquaintance, sat in the hall on the couch. The hostess put the cup on the table. She asked the guy if his rival was really dead. Bai answered the woman that Hu could be still alive, but he does not care about her. He was worried about his girlfriend. The woman told the guy that Ji got her strength, but not quite used to it. The girl in a deep dream should wake up soon. Ian scaredly said that the protagonist would not return to the old place. She suggested that a guy and a girlfriend live with her. The main character drank a drink from a glass. He told the hostess that when Jian woke up, they will leave here together. Jan looked in front of him and told her guests that he did not bother her at all. The hostess told the main character that she and her daughter were alive thanks to him. The girl silently sat on the floor and held a little bear in her hands. Suddenly, the toy in the hands of a surprised girl began to shake. Bai told his mother that her daughter's abilities became stronger. John answered the guy that when he was at home, the girl looks very happy. The main character held a glass in his hands. He told the woman that in 2 weeks he would no longer be in this city. Ian scaredly looked at the guy and repeated his words about 2 weeks. The main character looked angrily at the interlocutor and said that in 14 days, there would be the best moment to save Xiaoyan. Yang looked at the guest with great surprise and attention. She did not tell him anything. There was very heavy rain outside. Hu found the strength to run along the city streets in the morning. The woman held out her hand to her head and tried to take off her protective helmet. The entire protective frame on the body of the demoness scattered into small pieces. The woman could not continue to stand. She fell straight on a wet road. Hu viciously looked in front of her and threatened that she would find the main character everywhere. From the moment a small meteorite hit the ground, super enemy began to appear everywhere. The team of scientists found a black meteorite at the South Pole. He was in a large block of ice. It turned out that a large black stone released energy into the atmosphere. The team of scientists has changed due to this energy. They became the first super knights. The world government took possession of the black meteorite. 4 researchers later disappeared. Scientists returned many years later and created an international organization called the Corporation of the Light. They were engaged in the study of power from the depths of the black meteorite. Scientists carefully studied the stone. After a couple of years, black crystals called dark alpha crystals were created on its basis. If an ordinary person consumed such an alpha crystal, then he was likely to become a Superman. When a person absorbs the alpha critic, the stone is absorbed into his blood and concentrated in the heart. Superpludes that receive strength from the crystal become even stronger. It happens that a person, instead of gaining new forces, turns into a dangerous monster. The price of the crystal is very large. People are ready for anything to get it. The battles between super lugs became frequent. Even the organization of super night hunters appeared. Superpludes appear every day, but ordinary police cannot cope with violations that are associated with their death. Therefore, the global government created a new department called the Association of Superplies. The patient was lying on the bed with her eyes closed. She could not recover. After a small pause, Ji opened her eyes and looked up in front of her. The girl was very scared. She jumped sharply on the bed and screamed loudly. Ji looked around and could not understand where she was. She sat on the bed in the bedroom. The girl looked at her body in surprise and noticed that she was pajamas. Ji closed her eyes and with an effort tried to remember at least something. The girl remembered how she held out her hands to the main character. The guy flew away from her. Ji could not understand what happened. She remembered that she was overwhelmed by debris. The girl could not understand why she was still alive. The girl noticed something interesting on the side. She looked there in fright. Ji held in her hands a curl of her hair. She looked at them with surprise. The girl in the room screamed very loudly. The hostess in the corridor turned frightened. Jan ran into the room and excitedly asked the girl, "What happened?" The girl was sitting and holding her hands near her head. She looked very scared. Ji jumped sharply on the bed. She angrily asked the hostess, what did she need? Jan smiled and explained to the interlocutor that she was inviting her to eat breakfast. Ji was very surprised. She looked at the mistress with great distrust. The hostess led her guest to the dining room. Her daughter was already sitting at the table there. The hostess said that her daughter is called Qian Yu, and she does not really like to chat. The girl sat and silently absorbed her breakfast. Ji, with great excitement, told herself to herself that she sees her mother and daughter in front of her. The girl asked the hostess, "Where did the main character go?" The hostess told the girl that Bai Jing got out in the morning on business. She invited her to discuss what happened after she lost consciousness at breakfast. Ji thought about herself and realized that her new friend was called Bai Jing. The girl ate her breakfast. An empty plate remained on the table with a fork. Ji said with surprise to herself that she is a Superman. There is a dark crystal in her heart. Jan told the girl that her situation was very dangerous, and this was the only way for her. Hu very quickly hardened due to the water that Ji created during the battle. Ji looked in front of herself and remembered that she always thought before what her abilities could have if she became a Superman. Ian told the girl details about superhumans. At the moment, the maximum level of the human sphere is the 9th. Ji asked the hostess in a calm voice about her relationship with the main character. Ian explained to the interlocutor that she, together with the guy, is close friends. She will do everything that is needed for him. Ji looked at the girl with great excitement and carefully studied her. At this time, the main character entered the room silently in the room. Yang jumped up near the table. She told the guy that they had already begun to worry about him. Ji sat at the table. She looked at a new friend with great excitement. The main character put a large bag on the table in front of a surprised girl. Ji looked with great attention and interest in the bag. She did not know what was inside him. The girl looked closely and noticed how gold coins lay inside the bag. Ji scaredly asked the protagonist, "Why is all this for her?" The main character held out his hand to the bottle on the shelf. He told the girl that she could change gold coins at any bank in the world. He asked his girlfriend to leave this city rather. 13 days later, in this place, everything was supposed to be transformed beyond recognition. The protagonist, without turning around, told the girl that the world of superhumans is a terrible place. Ji asked the guy what would happen in 13 days, and how is this due to his sister. Jan noted to herself that the girl also knows about the sister of the protagonist. The hostess told her friend that the girl could stay at their home for safety. Outside there are still many hunters. The main character sat on the sofa and was silent. The hostess told the guy that when he, together with her girlfriend, will be at her house, she will be calm for her daughter. Jai turned frightened and looked at the protagonist. The guy consumed alcohol from a bottle. The main character told Ji to stay in this place. It would be safe for her. Ji thought to himself that the guy himself would like her to stay with him here. The main character now looked in front of him and held a bottle in his hands. Bai turned to the side and carefully looked at the girl on the couch. Yu silently sat on the couch. The guy looked at her very carefully. The main character silently looked out the window on the street. It was deserted there. On the street, a large red owl sat on top of the lantern. A magic talisman hung on her neck. The main character turned around and looked with great attention through the window on the street. Bai noticed that someone shot through the window in it with a bullet and a bright beam. From surprise, he dropped the bottle. All the girls in the room were very scared. They did not even have the strength to scream from fright. Suddenly, bright rays after bullets poured into the room from the street. The girls were very scared. Ian extended her hand sharply. She launched a great dense matter to protect. The hostess launched a dense protective barrier. Throughout the room from the street, bullets continued to fly into the room. The main character sternly told the girls that they remain inside the room and would not go anywhere. The guy accelerated and prepared to jump out into the street. The hostess called him in dismay. Bai at full speed jumped out of the window of the building and sharply flew down. The shooter scaredly noticed through his sight as the main character flew to him. The girl near the sniper rifle carefully watched the sight of the guy. He hit her with all his might. The sniper, after a powerful attack from the protagonist, flew far to the side. The main character looked around. He realized that Chin Yuisi shot him. The sniper raised her rifle and began to shoot from her at the protagonist. Bai beat off his bullets with very powerful and quick movements. He could not understand where the second shooter hid. The girl jumped up and began to shell the guy from the weapon from a height. The main character managed to notice how the sniper was behind him. He turned back. Chin grabbed her blade on her belt and prepared to attack the protagonist. The protagonist turned around very quickly around his axis. Bullets flew away from him. The girl directed the weapon to the guy. He noticed how she disappeared somewhere. He realized that Chin used teleportation. Bai looked up with interest and noticed how the girl flew at him with a sword. The main character carefully looked closely and realized that he would have to fight against two rivals. Bai landed in the forest. Chin viciously told the guy that the corporation issued an order to liquidate it. The main character viciously told the mercenaries that they found him thanks to owls. He promised to fry the bird. Shen put his sword on her shoulder. She told the guy that they accidentally found him. Yuisi with a rifle in his hands told the guy not to move. She promised to launch a bullet in his head and promised that he would not feel anything. The main character asked the mercenary, how can she know that he would not feel anything? She herself never died. The guy thought to himself that the Light Corporation came to his soul. He decided that something had happened to Xiaonian. Yu shouted to her girlfriend that she would attack the guy at the middle distance. Shen should be afraid of scorching radiance. The main character stood in the center of the meadow. The mercenaries began to surround him on both sides. The guy looked aside and noticed how a sniper began to shoot him from a rifle. Another mercenary waved a blade. Shen swung widely with a weapon and tried to hit the guy with a sword. The main character put his hands in front of him. He managed to defend himself from the girl's blow. Yu with a rifle shouted to her girlfriend to kill a guy with a pulsed blade. An owl appeared. She carried a big sword in her paws. Shen held out her hand to catch the weapon. The girl swung a blade and shouted with a smile to the guy that she could not go against the orders of the corporation. The mercenary waved to the main character with her sword. The guy sharply bounced back. Bai rushed to the side sharply. He thought that the girl's impulse blade is very fast and dangerous. The main character turned around and noticed with surprise how the girl cut a large tree with a sword. Bai held out his hand forward and grabbed a wide and huge tree with it. The mercenary began to wave in all directions. She cut a large log into many pieces. Shen looked around with surprise. She could not understand where the guy disappeared. The main character sharply appeared behind her. The mercenary scaredly turned to the guy and asked how he could get around her. The main character with all his strength swung his fist to attack the opponent. Yu grabbed her rifle and began to shoot massively at the protagonist. Bai tried to escape from shooting from the mercenary. He ran to the side and hooked him. The main character was very angry. He looked at the girl with hatred. Bai sharply swung his fist and hit the mercenary with all his might. She flew back. Shen turned around and looked at the guy with great attention. She was surprised at something. The girl looked at the fist of the protagonist and realized that the guy did not want to kill her. Shen swung her sword. She understood that she could not violate the order of the corporation. Bai looked at the girl in dismay. He realized that she would now cut him off with a sword. At the last moment, the girl stopped. She decided not to finish off the guy. A dissatisfied sniper with a rifle came up from the side and called her girlfriend. The sniper strictly ordered the mercenary to make her end with the main character. Shen with a smile told her girlfriend that she grabbed her stomach from bad food in the morning. Yu angrily answered the interlocutor that no one would believe in her words. Yu threw the rifle to the ground. She strictly asked her girlfriend to go aside. The main character was scared. He realized that impulse bullets would fly into him now. Yu put her hand back and grabbed a huge gun to use it against the guy. The mercenary sent a weapon to the protagonist and began to shoot at it. A girl with a weapon ran forward very quickly. Bullets flew in the direction of the protagonist. Jui thought that if a guy and a girl dodged the shots, then she would end. Bai put his hands in front of him to protect himself from bullets. Near the main character there was a very strong explosion. He was sharply thrown aside. The main character was very wounded. He had a bloody cough. Bai ran away very sharply and bounced back to protect himself from the bullet. The mercenary quickly ran up and climbed onto a tree to attack the protagonist. Bai turned sharply and looked at the girl and realized that she would continue to shoot. Yu directed her powerful weapon at him. There was a very strong explosion after a shot from a girl. There was a great twist over the clearing. Jan said with excitement to the girl that the main character was in a difficult battle. The woman scaredly told the girl that she would depart and help the main character. Ji and Yu will remain in this place and will not go anywhere. Ji was very excited. She looked with interest from the side of how the main character fought. Bai, after the next very powerful blow, flew away far to the side. The main character lay on the ground and could not rise. His whole body was bloodied. The guy scaredly thought that the shot with a pulsed bullet for him, like a shot from the tank. In front of him were two impregnable and professional killers, but rushed sharply and ran forward to attack the protagonist. Bai realized that it was time to act. He swung widely with his hand and hit wood. The protagonist hit the tree with all his might and cut it. He lifted him over him. Bai held a huge tree above his head and prepared to throw it into the girl. The mercenary jumped up to protect herself from a tree flying on her. Yu looked angrily in front of her. A huge tree flew past her. The girl reloaded the weapon and the bullets fell out of the pistols to the ground. The mercenary threw new cartridges into the pistol to continue shooting. The girl rushed forward and put the gun in front of her for shooting. The main character swung his right hand. He decided to repeat the trick with Jin. The protagonist spread widely with his hand and with all his might hit it on the ground. After a blow, a very strong explosion rang out into the ground. The girl was thrown back. Bai accelerated from behind and prepared to sharply hit the girl with his fist. Yu stuck the gun back and began to shoot at the protagonist. She struck him. The protagonist, after a very powerful shot from the rival, flew away far back. The mercenary glanced angrily at the guy and said that he could not repeat twice the reception. Bai looked angrily at the rival. He did not have time to heal his left hand, and he received a deep wound in his stomach. The mercenary sent a weapon to the guy and prepared to shoot him. The main character launched a bunch of blue energy against the opponent. She did not have time to defend herself. After a powerful blow by energy, the mercenary was taken far aside. There was a strong explosion. Through the broken window of the building, the battle on the street was watched by G and Yu. G and the girl stood in the window and looked at the street with great surprise. The girl said that it was interesting on the street, and they can go out and see. G was surprised that her companion could talk. The girl reminded her daughter that her mother told them to stay here. Yu reminded the interlocutor that she was worried about the protagonist. G asked the girl, "Is she really not worried about her mother?" Yu grabbed her companion for clothes and said that they needed to go and see. A huge ice paw appeared from the woman's hand. She told herself that she had two enemies. The woman's hands turned into ice blades. She shouted that her abilities are needed to save lives, but she could also kill them. G suddenly felt how she herself began to become much smaller in size. The girl became very small. She saw a huge girl in front of her and asked what she did to her. The frightened G saw how the girl grabbed her with her huge hand. Yu held her little companion in her hands and jumped out of the window to the street. On the street, the main character stood with a woman. Jan put up a huge magic shield against the mercenary. The woman scaredly asked the protagonist, "How does he feel?" Yu thought that she was standing in front of her. The rival was able to resist her impulse bullet. The mercenary decided not to waste time. She quickly ran forward to the protagonist and Jan.